now welcome Lee Craigie from Scotland, the Active Nation Commissioner, to take the floor. Lee, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks very much for having me. I've sat here and listened with real interest to the other three keynote speakers. It's been really interesting to hear what's happening around the world and see just how it fits with quite a lot of the stuff that's happening in Scotland. I thought I'd start just with a little bit of background about my role as the Active Nation Commissioner in Scotland. It's an interesting role. I'm an independent commissioner to the Scottish Government, but interestingly, it's funded by Transport Scotland, and that should have probably been highlighted to me at the start. I didn't realise at the start of this that although my title is Active Nation Commissioner for Scotland, a lot of people confuse that with Active Travel Commissioner for Scotland, which is really interesting and comes with it a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities. But the whole idea around this post was to encourage people to think about how they moved around, to encourage people to leave their cars behind for everyday short journeys and consider cycling and walking as a healthy, sustainable alternative. So that was the agenda from the Scottish Government, but they employed for this role not a civil servant or a policy maker, not somebody from the industry, not an economist, not a tourism operator. They employed an ex-mountain bike racer, a cross-country mountain bike racer, who had a real passionate love for her sport. They employed an outdoor instructor, so I was an outdoor instructor before I was a mountain bike racer, and a child and adolescent psychotherapist. So for many years before taking on this role, I was involved in the behaviour change aspects, trying to encourage people to be more everyday, healthy, outdoors active for our mental and our physical health. They also employed the director of the Adventure Syndicate, which is a collective of women who ride very long distances self-supported by bike, like ultimate bike adventures. And we storytell about it, and we're very public online about the real health, emotional and physical health benefits of travelling self-supported by bike. And so all of those things, it's really interesting that they employed somebody to do this role with all of those different underpinning agendas, when across this post, the Active Nation Commissioner post, ticks all the government portfolios too. So we've got, this ticks if we can get people to undertake these short journeys by foot or by bike, then this ticks the health agenda, the environmental agenda, social justice, transport, economy, tourism, it's all there. But underpinning all of that, my personal motivation is really, really important to me, that I stand to one side of government and always with this, the health and environmental benefits over above any of those other ones. And so COVID-19 has been really interesting to me, because suddenly all of these different portfolios across our government are putting their hands up and pulling in the same direction together. And active travel is at the heart of that. Cycling, suddenly, I'm sure it's the same in all of your countries, but here in Scotland, in the city of Edinburgh, people have dug their bikes out of their sheds and they have reclaimed the streets, and they have refound a love for exploring their immediate locality by bike and by foot. So effectively, COVID-19 has been an absolute disaster. Across globally, lives have been lost and jobs have been lost, and people are very anxious and depressed. But it's done my job in many ways. It's really promoted this idea of what it is that we value. And what we're finding that we value here in Scotland is being outdoors and everyday active and having the physical space to do that. So, to wind back one more step, I want to describe a little bit more about me, because I think this is really important. I grew up in a really comfortable family. I'm white, I'm middle class. I grew up in a leafy suburb just outside Glasgow. I had an athletic mother as a female role model. I had access to green space, and I could travel to that green space autonomously on my little red BMX, and nobody batted an eyelid. that's how I started. That was how I got into this sport and how I progressed through all of these levels. That is what equips me for this role. I was a kid that got a lot out of being outdoors, active by their own agency. And then when I was about 14 or 15, we moved into the West End of Glasgow. So I moved from that suburb where I had access to that green space. I could travel independently and explore and grow and meet my friends and be curious on my bike. I moved from there into the city centre. And it was just at that time that I needed my autonomy. I was becoming a young woman and I really, really needed to be able to travel independently. And this is key, because this is when I discovered a network of green corridors out of my city. So I wasn't a mountain biker, but I did have a mountain bike. And I used to take this thing for miles. Like, I used to find little, here in Scotland, we have an organisation, Sustrans, who do an incredible job of mapping off traffic-free routes out of cities and across the UK. And I got this map from a local bike shop and I followed these routes out of the city, and I'd get a bit lost and I'd get a bit scared, and then I'd jump on a train and I'd come home. And that, when I look back, was a really formative time for me. And when I think about access to my sport, I think how lucky I was to have that resilience, to be able to do that, to be able to get on my bike. I had a bike, I had a mum that was permissive. I lived in a city where you could get out reasonably quickly and get into green space. I felt reasonably safe. I understood how public transport operated. All of these things are absolutely key when we're talking about how we're going to grow the sport of mountain biking in our new way of being. And I'll come on to that later. I think the word COVID's being bandied around way too much. We'll leave that until the end. So I've set the scene. You get the idea of my sort of personal journey, my motivation up to that point. So now I'm a young woman. I've been emancipated through the bicycle, like I'm sure many of us have, across the world. And I go down that very same route of encouraging other people, making sure that other people have access to being outdoors and everyday active. But I noticed as an outdoor instructor, as a young outdoor instructor, that not everybody had this. It was really clear to me that I was working with groups of people who, especially in mountain biking, that had their own bikes. They were usually white, they were normally from middle class backgrounds. Their parents would drive them to trail centres or drive them to outdoor spaces in order to practice our wonderful sport, and that didn't seem very fair to me. And it also felt as though the most important work that I was doing were with the kids that didn't have that. They were the ones that got the most out of being introduced to these green spaces. So I retrained as a child and adolescent psychotherapist so that I could go into these areas and work with people using bikes as a medium, but the people first. And that is also key when it comes to this role, because this role as Active Nation Commissioner in Scotland is all about behaviour change. If you're going to encourage people to move around by bike, travel actively by bike, enjoy being outdoors and physically active, you can't go into a school and stand up there and talk about active travel. You see a sea of faces just glaze over. You go in there and you talk about when you rode the Tour Divide, 3,000 miles self-supported by mountain bike, and it starts just outside your front door there on that doorstep. Imagine that road outside your school was traffic free and you could jump on your bike and you could ride yourself home. And that road that you ride home links up to another road that links up to another road that links up to another road. And before you know it, you can travel around the world too. That's the stuff that inspires, and that's the stuff that captures imaginations. And young people, I found, are my best ally in driving this agenda. They know the benefits already, and they're not already addicted to their cars. They've got nothing to gain from remaining rooted in the way that we do in our velvet ruts as adults, to being wedded to private polluting vehicles. So what's come out of all of this for me, this crisis in Scotland, what's come out of all of this for me? The importance of place making, the importance of understanding what people need in order to be outdoors and physically active. And I am talking about particularly mountain biking, because I think mountain biking is an absolutely key way to encourage people to have fun. I think we're losing that idea. and I stand on a lot of panels, and I speak to a lot of policymakers, and I speak to a lot of people that are worried about their business going under on high streets, and they're concerned about the economy, and they're concerned about tourism, and all of these things are incredibly important, and I've so enjoyed listening to everybody talk about that stuff. But ultimately, it needs to be fair, and it needs to be accessible to everybody, and it needs to be fun. Everybody needs to understand that right now you could go outside. If you have access to a bike, you could go outside and you could change your relationship with your environment. Focusing on the fun to be had, how it makes you feel, and one step down from that, if you're not a kid, you are quite often motivated by money. And so what I'm finding is if you find those levers, the money and the feel-good factor, then the other stuff that underpins our societies, the stuff that actually we need to be writing into our policies, the things that we should be picketing our governments about social justice and about our environment, that stuff just happens. So mountain biking is very well placed. It's I don't need to extol the benefits of it anymore. I'm on a call with 126 participants that I'm sure understand that fun, that feel-good factor, and a lot of you probably understand the social justice and environmental gains to be had from mountain biking as well. But I think there's some challenges in our industry as well that I think it's my responsibility here to highlight. I feel really strongly about this. We've not just been hit by COVID-19 lately. All of you will be aware of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think what's been so interesting to me is that we, quite often in the outdoors, I'm not just talking about mountain biking, but in the outdoors in general, we shy away from this idea that it's not that inclusive or diverse a sport. You need a lot of money. You need to be able to travel to trail centres. You did in the past. Maybe that'll change now with green corridors out of cities that I've been really excited about hearing as the focus. A lot of people, mountain biking's got a reputation for packaging your bike up and sticking it on a plane to go and ride the French Alps. But here we have an opportunity to reclaim the grassroots of this stuff. If we can ensure that nobody gets left behind in this green recovery, if we can ensure that mountain biking is accessible to everybody, no matter what your background, you've got access to a bike, there are incentives for you riding that bike to school where someone might help you repair it so that you can find those green corridors on the weekend. That's the stuff that I think is going to make a difference. And that's the stuff that's going to capture policymakers and funders' eyes. If we can make sure that mountain biking recovers in a diverse, inclusive, sustainable way, then I think we're absolutely onto something. I also feel strongly that, I'm biased. I live in Scotland and I love Scotland, and I think we've got a great access code, and our cities are just big towns really, and we can get out of them quickly, most of us, not all of us, but most of us. And so I definitely feel there's a big groundswell around the recovery from the crisis being very much in keeping with what I'm hearing across all the other keynote speakers, which is exciting. This idea of adventure travel, self-supported adventure travel, and people remaining and reconnecting with what it means to stay local, to travel locally, so to travel Scotland-wide in my case. I think there's real scope for encouraging that. Cyclotourism, off-road cyclotourism in particular, I think this might be it's time for another step up of expansion. We need to be thinking about moving away from this idea that we need to drive out of our cities to access great trails, and that we need to fly somewhere to find new places. There's so much can happen on our doorstep, and I'm not an economy expert, I'm not a tourism expert, but if we can focus on re-injecting the money that we have in our community here in Scotland and send everybody north from the central belt, then maybe those small businesses on those high streets in the Cairngorms and in the northwest, they won't suffer quite so much as everybody is worried that they will. Yeah, I guess just one last thing about quiet streets. This placemaking agenda, I felt quite far removed from my love of mountain biking in this job, in the first year in this role. I felt like I've been standing on a lot of street corners looking at drop curbs and wondering about how all these people can travel their you know, a range of bikes and wheelchairs and pedestrians, you know, around city centres. And I'm not a city planner. That's not my passion. That's not my love. But what I've noticed here with the quiet streets and the resurrection of all bikes, mountain bikes, old BMXs, rusty tourers, everything, what I've noticed is there's this groundswell. And if we can just step out of our silo as passionate mountain bikers and think about inclusion across the board, think about health across the board, your walker, if you can encourage somebody to walk 2 kilometres, then maybe that next step might be to travel 4 kilometres, and then before you know it, they might have engaged a Sustrans route and bought themselves a nice new shiny mountain bike a few years down the line. I think we need to be broadening our mindset right out to include everybody.